That was the warning issued to the UK government by a parliamentary inquiry into the impact climate change could have on this country's critical infrastructure. Its report claims that our national security is being jeopardised because ministers have failed to properly prepare for the increasing risk posed by extreme weather events. Well, Professor Keith Bell from the University of Strathclyde is a co-director of the UK Energy Research Centre and is an expert in electricity infrastructure. Good morning to you, Professor Bell.
Good morning, Laura.
I understand that you made a submission to the Joint Committee on National Security Strategy and their inquiry. So do you agree with their findings that there is an extreme weakness in how the government prepares for these things?
Yes, I think this is an excellent report. It highlights some extremely important issues. Things happen. Various bits of critical infrastructure experience disturbances, whether due to extreme weather or equipment failure or whatever. But what impacts do those disturbances have? And of course, a particular focus is on how well we are adapted to climate change and the extreme weather that comes along with it. Higher temperatures in summer, higher rainfall in winter, the potential for extreme winds. And the report highlights, as you were mentioning in the news summary, the government's abject failure to deliver, in particular on the Climate Change Committee's adaptation recommendations. It highlights the need for resilience, the prevention of these adverse impacts from disturbances and containment if you can't prevent them completely, and recovery from them. And that all depends on preparation. And that's the thing, I think, that the committee is highlighting is a lack of preparation, and also the siloing of preparation where things are left to particular ministries or particular sectors of industry to kind of do their own thing. And there's a lack of recognition of the interdependencies between these different sectors and the potential for disturbances to cascade across them. So,
is there a sort of sense, sorry to interrupt, but I was just going to say, is there a sort of sense that for too long government's been saying, well, these are extreme events and you can't prepare for all eventualities, and actually they're not now no longer that extreme anymore?
Absolutely, and this is something again that the CCC in particular has, the Climate Change Committee has highlighted, that climate change means that things we used to think of as being extreme weather are no longer so extreme. So the high temperatures that we saw this summer, high rainfall we've seen in a number of years, those things are becoming quite normal and need to be factored into the design of critical infrastructure.
How vulnerable is our infrastructure then?
So there's always a vulnerability, and it's impossible to say that we can prevent all of the adverse outcomes. Like I say, design of this infrastructure has to take that into account, but if not that, then we can contain it. We can provide services to critical parts of what society needs and to individuals in the meantime. So the preparation is also about surviving in the meantime and recovering from these disturbances. And it's about the key agencies, the individual industry actors and government, to have an eye on what these vulnerabilities are and to keep those that supervision under review all the time, because things are changing all the time. The sorts of technologies that we're using are changing. This is something we highlighted in the UK Energy Research Centre submission, is that dependency on electricity is increasing. So we're highly dependent on it for communication, for lighting, but increasingly for heat and transport as we reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So that kind of critical bit of the infrastructure has to be looked after and reviewed all the time to see how things are changing.
Well, I know that electricity infrastructure is your area of expertise, so let's maybe, because a lot of this is it's not something that we talk about on a day-to-day basis, so let's use an example then, perhaps of Storm Arwen and the damage caused to the electricity infrastructure during that. How could we have been better prepared? What should the government be doing now off the back of that to make sure that people aren't left for in some cases, 10 days without electricity?
Yeah, that's just a terrible circumstance to be in. I think codes and standards are a really important part of this, to make sure that the industry understands what it needs to do, and then enforcement of those standards as well. So it's something, again, that the committee report that's just been published has highlighted is or there are some gaps in that. There's some gaps in taking responsibility. Another thing that it highlighted also is, as well as the individual sectors' preparedness and its ability to respond, is the communication. The electricity regulator made a report into Storm Arwen and how the distribution network operators performed there. They found mixed performance. Some parts were done actually quite well, other parts really quite poor. One of the poor things was about communication, letting people know what was happening. And then actually it's a cross-sector thing for how you look after people in the meantime, especially those who are most vulnerable. And this committee report that's just come out highlighted the role of, in England, local resilience forums, and what the equivalent here in Scotland would be regional resilience partnerships, which are multi-agency activities to try and make sure that people are looked after. For example, going out and seeing that people are okay, providing access to emergency energy supplies, kind of a safe haven, if you like, in a community centre, and making sure that the different actors that would know about that and can help to make it happen are talking to each other. And the committee criticised the kind of lack of funding and definition of what those sorts of sorts of forums and partnerships are supposed to be doing.
That's how you deal with it, but I suppose how do you prevent it happening in the first place? So should we be burying electricity cables? That would stop trees hitting them, that would stop the wind blowing them down. It would also stop them being affected by a heat wave. In other parts of the country, we haven't been so much affected by the heat waves, but the south of England has. Should we be doing things like that now to prevent these blackouts in the future?
Well, burying doesn't make completely invulnerable to heat waves. But it's a question of what kind of infrastructure in which places. So a lot of the bits of the network that were affected in Storm Arwen was kind of the long, stringy bits of network out into the countryside. So those are long bits of overhead line, extremely expensive and difficult to underground. But other actions could be taken, such as, for example, making sure that the sort of vegetation nearby to the overhead lines is well managed. So it's less likely that high winds would cause debris to fly across and damage the overhead lines.
How much of that can you blame on government, though? Because, there's landowners, the big electricity companies, people like that, they all have to be involved. So why should we need a UK minister appointed to oversee all of this, whenever actually people should take responsibility for their own bits of it?
Absolutely, it's a fair question. But then the regulatory environment in which those companies operate is set by government and by a regulator. And especially for owners, a lot of the owners of critical infrastructure are, if you like, natural monopolies, like water companies, the electricity network companies. And the role of regulation is really important. So the regulator is trying to keep bills down for bill payers, minimizing, if you like, the costs and scrutinizing what those companies are doing. But on the other hand, that could lead to, a squeezing of expenditure in the short term, and potentially a lack of attention to what's necessary in the longer term. So again, back to what the committee's report has said, that it's better to, according to them, it's high time that government learn that prevention is better than cure, and it requires preparation for the longer term. And the regulators appointed by government, with their own remit, defined by government, have to take that into account, the balance between short-term considerations and long-term considerations against these things that have a low probability still in spite of climate change, but a very high impact when they happen.
Keith, thank you very much indeed for talking to us this morning. Professor Keith Bell there, who's from the University of Strathclyde and is a co-director of the UK Energy Research Centre.